Word now. Okay, so hi everybody. Today, this is my favorite topic, maybe ever, and definitely of this class. I think the only one that will kind of even attempt to get close to it is when we talk about Disneyland and when we talk about Orange County, the Orange County punk scene. But this is actually what I study very closely. So I'm very excited. I will try not to get lost in the weeds. This is talking about conservation that is a bit before the conservation that I talk about in my research. My research more focuses on 1900 to like 1960, and this is more focused on 1860 to will be flirting a little bit with 1900 in this lecture, but yeah, we're not quite getting there. There'll be some mentions to how some of the topics that come up in this lecture will relate to further things, and I'll try to bring those things back up again when we're further along in the timeline. But today we're talking about early Californian conservation and environmentalism. An extra credit update. So because of losing 2 days to holidays, you only need to attend 15 lectures instead of 17 for extra credit. Is somebody getting a Zoom call? I'm hearing the little Zoom sound. Sorry if you're not also hearing that, but it was just confusing. So because of losing 2 days to holidays, you only need to attend 15 lectures instead of 17 for the extra credit. So when I made this class, I did not know if Juneteenth would be approved by Congress, and it was right before class started, and I didn't realize that we were remembering the 4th of July on the 5th of July. So I didn't take that into account when I came up with the number, because I did want to, you know, I knew that we were going to take the day off for midterms. However, I didn't know that, I did want it to be possible for you to get extra credit and, you know, maybe have something happen that got in the way of attending lectures. So so instead of attending 17 lectures, you just have to do 15. I am keeping track of that by the end of the week. If you want an update, I can share that with you. Giselle asked, how many days has it been so far? It's been 11. This is the 11th day. So there's that. Today I am also trying a new technique with Buddy, which I did not want to do. It's a spray bottle, but when he starts barking, I'm just going to spray him. So if you hear a strange sound, that's that. So if you have any questions about extra credit, please just let me know. I need to tally the last few days, but I can give you an update on it by the end of the week. So just if you want it more urgently, I can check. I can, you know, like bump you up to the top of the list. It's just yeah, it just takes a little bit of time because I have to go through each chat log. So thanks for your patience on that. Today I thought I got rid of the transition on this one, but this is Chloe. She just looks so beautiful. I also really appreciate this, I'm assuming, blanket that's right by her. Look at that little nose with the little snoot. It's a little cute snoot. I really appreciate her fuzziness. My dog Lando is similar, and just kind of the graceful draping of her whiskers. What a joy, what a delight. Thank you so much for sharing this. Another question in the chat, the week 2 attendance won't count to the total 15, right? No, they won't. So because this is a 6-week course and we have 4 days a week, there are I can do math. 4 times 6 is 24. There's 24 lectures. 4 of them were already for week 2. were already, asynchronous, so that they don't count. Stevie, okay, and then referring to Chloe, Stevie says she is so cute but not very smart. No thoughts behind those eyes. She could have fooled me. She looks like a really deep and like thoughtful thinker, but I think it's just how she's gazing into the camera, which I'm assuming is gazing into you. So perhaps her thoughts for you are very deep. This week's question, weekly response is to pick a California state or national park or a city that you would like to know more about, and for your response, answer the following questions that you can using the sites or cities website. So this is the website for Whittier, California. This is where I'm from. They have a really detailed history page on the city's website. I know especially bigger cities will have that too. I tried just putting in random towns in California, and for the most part I was seeing, a at least a couple, like a page or two, at least like 1,000 words of history. Similarly, this is the website for Yosemite. It's a very well-known park, so it has a lot of history on there. And I want you to pick a California state or national park or city and answer these questions in the response. So when was it established? Who established it? Who was responsible for making it? So this is a little different than who established it. Like, who were the first people who like settled it or worked with the, establishers? For example, today you'll hear more about John Muir in Yosemite. So John Muir was one of the people to like really establish it, but the people responsible for making it were different local concessionaires or people who wanted to offer services to making it more of a tourist site. Also, how many people live or visit there on average? What historical events happened there? Have any famous people lived or worked there? What are 3 interesting spots in this place and why are they interesting? And then the last question is, have you been there? Why or why not? So I will warn you that for big sites, whether it's like a big city like San Francisco or LA, and potentially even big parks like Yosemite or even Sequoia, you might be overwhelmed with information on the website. Especially in the case for cities, that'll be the case. Parks, probably less so. But I encourage you to find one that you actually are interested in and not that you just assume will be easy because you have heard about it in class, or especially as Santa Barbara is off the table. I will just make that distinction because you could answer that question just from lecture. But we haven't explicitly talked about Goleta. We haven't explicitly talked about Carpinteria just yet. We haven't explicitly talked about San Diego actually that much, and that is a big city. So play around with it, but find something that you're actually interested in. If you're from California, maybe like look at your hometown. If you live in LA but it's really like a specific location like Echo Park or Santa Monica or even West LA or North Hollywood, those fall under the bigger umbrella of LA, but they're also much more specific sites that have a much more specific history. So this is really, hopefully you're taking this class because you're interested in the history of California in some way, and it isn't just for a general ed. And because this is a primarily site-based class, like this is, our focus is California, even though it's part of the much bigger history of US. Hopefully there are some things that are going on in California, some places that you're really interested in learning more about. And so this is an opportunity, especially because this week we're talking about sorry, especially because this week we're talking about the creation of parks and cities. I hope that you take on this with some kind of interest, and potentially, it could be something that helps you for your final paper. So things to consider, So last week we talked, or sorry, geez, last lecture we talked about Placerville, a little bit about the Hangtown controversy. Mining camps generally were wild and lawless. It was truly the Wild West. You have a lot of division, especially racial and later on class division that is happening in the West. It starts out as a place of freedom, a place of experimentation, and then in a lot of ways it ends up repeating some of the same social norms that the original uh, the original Euro Americans who left the East Coast wanted to run away from. So, I mean, the biggest issue that is actually going to bleed into our topic for today is racism and exclusion on the basis of racism. So, during this time period, really starting in the 1860s, especially as immigrants came in on now both coasts of the U.S., we have an upsurgence of discrimination against people from anywhere in Europe, basically. This is especially true at this time in, again, 1860s for Irish folks who were running from the potato famines. We have Italians who are seen as dirty and seen as lazy. Germans were coming over, and for the most part they were given a little bit more respect because they were coming over more by choice and rather than getting away from perils in their home country. And with this upsurgence of people, this is truly the time in the 1860s, 1870s where we're getting into industrialization, we're getting into the shift of the US being seen as a more rural, agricultural, close-knit, for a lack of better word, middle class, except, of course, for enslaved peoples and later freed peoples who were not given access to resources that they needed to join that middle class. But we have a lot of racial tension starting at this time, and so nativism was a very popular political thought, and nativists believed, kind in a very ironic way, in a very confusing way, nativists believed that they were true Native Americans, despite being descended from immigrants. This is when I first learned about this in my undergrad. It came up in a 19th century American lit class. I was very confused, and whenever I try to explain nativism to people now, especially because it's become a bigger part of what I study, I still just feel very baffled by this, because you you have nativists who, President Teddy Roosevelt is included in this nativist thought. You have nativists who believe that they're Native Americans, however, they're part of institutions or even parts of groups who are enacting genocide on the actual Native people in this place. It is very confusing, but this is how they understood it, and using the historical information and knowledge. We have to put them in their proper context. This is how they saw themselves. So there was much nativist sentiment that was focused on Irish Americans. German and Chinese immigrants came under attack as well. So Germans were were coming most primarily through the East Coast, and like I said, they were understood to be more. They had more access to resources. They tended to be able to acclimate a little bit better into a middle class. A lot of them were doctors or had other skills that lent them, that their new local community felt lent itself to building the community, whereas people who had less means were seen, as pests, seen as and this is something that we heard in the 20th and now in the 21st century, drains on society. Chinese immigrants didn't initially experience as much attacks. Of course, anti-Asian sentiment totally rises, as you hopefully watched yesterday, for the documentary, but also they weren't given as much grief initially as Irish and Italians, and of course, and also freed or formerly enslaved folks, because they were seen as they were primarily on the West Coast, and they were primarily understood to be super duper useful labor for building the railroad. And they also had, by law, had to work for cheaper rates, and so they were understood to be pretty useful in getting a job done. This is in no way acceptable, right? This is in no way fair. This is heinous. This is racist. This is a huge contribution to the even current anti-Asian sentiment that is not only in California but in throughout the U.S. and frankly also much of the global Western world. But this is the historical context. There were exclusion acts that we will get to a little bit more in detail tomorrow when we talk about the rise of cities, that once the infrastructure that Chinese immigrants built were complete, Chinese immigrants were also seen as similar, quote unquote, drains on society. Um, all of this is to try to explain some of the background information of discrimination and nativist thought. Related to all of this is this idea of filibustering, which is this is actually very different than how we understand and talk about filibusters today. Filibusters being um, a method used in Congress to stop a bill from being passed by basically taking over the conversation. Filibustering in California history was freeing unprotected territory from foreign control. So freeing is a very generous way that our textbook describes this, but basically residents who were very close to especially the southern border of the US would try to free or liberate areas in order to expand the US continent. They practitioners of this thought that they were helping other people by bringing them freedom. Of course, this is being built up by manifest destiny. This is also being fueled by a sense of entitlement and a sense of uh, belief that the US is best. But this is also going on and also being fueled by this discriminatory, racist, very white supremacist thought that was really active at this time, and arguably in some parts of the US and California continues today. But so with that in mind, a little bit more about nativists and discrimination. So, whether they were just being racist to people in their community or attacking border towns, nativists were worried about a lot of the same things that contemporary racists are still concerned with, which is jobs, that they'll lose their jobs to either foreign influence or people from other countries taking them during the 19th century, 1850s, 1860s, again, with the upsurgence of Irish immigrants coming in. There was a worry about Catholic influence. So if you are not Catholic or not aware of kind of Catholic history, the Pope is in charge of the church. And historically speaking, the Pope has caused a lot of geopolitical unrest, especially from the Middle Ages to at least the 17th century. At least the 17th century. I think the last big geopolitical thing that the Pope did involved Henry VIII. So it had been a couple centuries before, but the popes of the past had also created the Crusades and killed thousands upon thousands of Muslim people. For example, they were called Moors in Spain. The Pope got up to a lot of popes. I don't know how to say this without sounding anti-Catholic, even though I'm Catholic, but the popes had been responsible for killing a lot of people and having a lot of political power. And so this was something that nativists were really frightened of because of the Irish upsurgence of Irish people in the country. They were also concerned with how close-knit the Irish community could be. So even though they were excluding these people, they also wanted to not be excluded. Again, a kind of messy context, but these people, this is an example of 19th century white supremacy. They felt entitled to having it all. And then tied to the Catholic influence was the considering of political influence. So immigrants at this time tended to vote Democratic, and they didn't want to have an imbalance of power just because that there were floods of people coming into especially New York, but also into San Francisco every day. So a little bit more about nativist politics. It really started right around the statehood of California, with the creation of a secret society, the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. This is in New York City, but within a few years, especially as people are continuing to move westward, the thought also moves westward. This later becomes the Know Nothing or American Party that worked towards limiting immigration, political power, and influence, and wanted to restrict naturalization laws. So naturalization is the process that someone from another country will go through in order to become an American citizen. They wanted to... Yes, Giselle, in the chat you say this gives me Gangs of New York movie vibes. You're not wrong. So you're not wrong. But restrictive naturalization would impede immigration because it would make it even more hard for people from other countries to actually become US citizens. And again, we will talk about this a little bit more tomorrow with different exclusion the Chinese Exclusion Act and other laws that were put in place to make this possible. So the Know Nothings, this continues to get really bad. You have the influx of immigrants coming from Ireland's potato famine in the 1840s. You have the Know Nothing Party that is staunchly in denial of anti-immigrant activities and secret societies. So they're saying they're the Know Nothing Party because they think they're being smart and saying, oh, I know nothing about these anti-immigrant things. And that was kind of a dog whistle or a kind of secret way to indicate the opposite of what they're saying. Like, I know nothing about anti-immigrant stuff. However, and to somebody who wouldn't know, that just sounded like the answer that they'd want to hear. I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's cool. But if you knew something about the Know Nothings, you knew that them saying, I know nothing, was a signal that they knew all sorts of things. And if you had a similar mindset, you would join them and do the same. So also, while this discrimination is really churning and burning, we also have the Industrial Revolution taking place. So this was in part related to the changes that were happening with the US becoming less rural and more urban. So there was a change from handmade to machine-made goods. So this comes to the US late. So this really kicks off in the depending on which historian you read, 1820s, 1830s, especially in England, and then, continues going through Europe. But it comes to the US in the late 1850s and 1860s. But it comes late because land was cheap in the US, and so most people could kind of build their own fortunes based off the land. You have money for capital investment, not being very plentiful here. So it takes a lot of money to start a business. That is another thing that hasn't changed, that people still experience now. And if you have a whole bunch of people who are middle class, you don't have access to even borrowing enough money to create factories. Also, it wasn't until the US expanded to the West Coast that they discovered many more raw materials that they could use to actually manufacture things. They had fewer consumers because until the 1850s, 1860s, the US, again, rural, not a lot of folks over here. So this is happening, that we are seeing the development of factories. We're seeing everybody going to factories, especially if you were from an immigrant family. You have women from other countries, potentially, speaking very little English, working on machines, making especially clothes, doing kind of making handmade seeming crafts, but through machines. You even have children working with their quick, nimble fingers, being able to navigate the fast moving machines and make sure that they were operating correctly and cleaned. There were a few folks who really started as soon as photography became a more stable thing that, wasn't just taking pictures in a stationary place, having a huge camera. Once a camera could be more easily taken to places, you have photographers like Lewis Hine, who took this series of images in, I want to say, the 1870s, capturing and creating pictures of this kind of work. And later on, we'll get into this a little bit more, maybe on Thursday or the next week, that creates a rise in labor reforms and a rise in wanting to do things differently, make things more equal, but we'll get to that when we get there. We also talked a little bit about the Transcontinental Railroad. So this is also making industrialization and, for tomorrow, urbanization more possible, because, you know, you have from sea to shining sea of the US being connected, and being connected in a relatively easy way. I mean, did it take a while to go from one to another? Like, it wasn't a 6 or 7 hour flight. It was days of going, but there was a way for that to happen. Before the Transcontinental Railroad and the Pony Express, another service that was used to send letters, for the most part, if somebody went west, you know, before 1860, you weren't going to see them again unless you moved there yourself. And you might not see them again because they may have died, and there wasn't a way for you to know. So, I mean, this isn't to say that it was completely impossible. Some letters could go through, but it would take months. It would take months and months, and because itineraries would change due to different conditions of trails, you wouldn't know. So the development of two railroad companies, you know, one being the Union Pacific and the other being the Central Pacific, was a way to actually bring people together. That kind of sounds cheesy, because it's like, yeah, like they're connecting the railroad, but this was also connecting the country in ways that started to make the country actually feel more unified and not as just a collection of states. So we can see here, this is Union Pacific, this is Central Pacific, and there were other railroads already going, other railroad systems already going through the rest of the country. So you just had to get to Omaha, and then you could get to where you needed to go. So like we talked about a little yesterday, most of the Union Pacific track was built by Irish laborers, veterans of both the Union and Confederate armies, also Mormons who wanted to see the railroad pass through Ogden, Utah. There were also Chinese workers who were building most of the Central Pacific track, because remember, they're coming in through San Francisco, so they are going this way, while Union Pacific is working to go this way. They wanted to unify the Pacific, and then Central Pacific wanted to move more central. That's at least how I remember it. So here are just a couple examples of the labor that was done. Very grueling, very manual, depending on where they were setting tracks. Some, you know, things had to be blown up. They would blow through parts or even insides of mountains. Some mountains even went through. They would use whatever they needed, whether it was dynamite or pickaxes or shovels. They would work 10 to 12-hour days, 6, sometimes 7 days a week, for barely any pay. It wasn't attractive for many, but it was work for those who needed it. And increasingly, especially in the 1850s, 1860s, more people needed it. This came out a little more grainy than I wanted, but as in comparison to this, which is a much flatter track, some areas needed to actually build up even more infrastructure. Having done just the smallest amount of carpentry 2 weeks ago, I can say that this is all very, very hard labor, especially outdoors. And under the sun, in the heat, also needing to clear out some of the forest. Like, this was not glamorous, fun work in the least. And this picture came out way grainier than I wanted, but here is a little choo-choo in action. Another choo-choo in action shot. So we have these developments. We have a whole bunch of racists who are especially upset with the upsurgence of immigration, which is also happening because immigrants want jobs, they want freedom, they want a sense of community, they want a piece of the pie of freedom pie that the US offers them. So we have what our textbook calls the messy land problem. Because if you remember with California, first there were indigenous people on this land who had different conceptions of what ownership to land was. Some believing that they were owned by the land, not that they owned the land. But with Spanish colonization in really beginning in the 1600s, you have them creating missions 100 or so years after their first colonization. Then you have the creation of Mexico in the early 1800s, who have their own system of land grants that they're selling big swaths of land to, and then those people are selling smaller cuts of that same land. And then when California enters the US as a state in 1850, what do we do with the people who owned that land in the first place? This is messy, and the US has its own set of land grants, and it is not clear what, if anything, the Mexican land grants mean. Eventually, depending on the area of California, this was settled through different sets of law that not everyone, especially the people who had Mexican land grants, agreed with. There were tensions that tried to be sorted out, even by descendants. And actually, to be honest, a lot of there are still contestations of how the land grants going from Mexican to American played out, and you have descendants still taking things to court. It is very messy because, again, California has a lot to offer. California has bountiful natural resources. California has a lot of space. California has a lot of promise because it's close to the ocean. It has multiple ports of call, and it's also promising because it's just so big. And the temperature, for the most part, especially by the coast, is very moderate in comparison to, the East Coast. So there's a lot that California can offer, and everybody wanted a little piece. So with this, there's a lot of issues. One, especially, is squatting, which means the same thing that it does in the 21st century, which is basically someone saying, this land is my land, and I will just be here because it is my land, and then just not moving. This was a much bigger problem in the 19th century, but as we'll talk about, especially when we get to the punks, it has continued to be a thing and has meant lots of lots of different meanings. What does it mean to own land in the first place, which as a callback to our indigenous kind of culture week, indigenous kind of conceptions of land would kind of be the same. Like, well, what does it even mean to own land? Like no. You also, with gold mining, you also have a similar thing happening with claim jumping. So you have miners who are buying little spots of land for them to mine and claim, claim for themselves to mine. But then you have other people jumping, so going from their claim to a new claim and trying to either take it over or try to sneak mine that area when someone else isn't looking, or when the owner of that claim isn't looking. what makes this even more complicated, like I said, is not only we have a complex system of all of these different claims that have been made to California land, but with California entering the statehood, we have an unclear bureaucracy of which land was owned by whom and how is that recognized by the US. So not only is it unclear whose land it is, but it's also unclear how to figure out who owns what. I did not put the dates of the Homestead Act and the Timber and Stone Act, which is very bad on my part. Oh no, I feel like I'm being tested right now. Homestead Act of 1853, Timber and Stone Act of, I want to say that's 1864. Okay, I will put it in the chat when we're done with this. The Homestead Act was an incentive that was used to put in, it was an incentive to get people to go to the West. It was a promise that if you worked, you know, I'm debating whether or not to describe this as small. It seemed small at the time. It was not small. 1862, thank you, David. 1862. That if you worked 500 acres and you developed it in a way that made it more useful, especially for farming and industry, you owned that land, and that was it. Timber and Stone Act was similar in that you just had to work it to make it useful, but this was used in regards to land that was not seen as usable for farming. And so this is where places like Yosemite and Sequoia and places with really big trees and not enough area to, create a large scale farm, this is where the Timber and Stone Act comes in. So you have people who are making claims left and right using law. You have people making claims left and right not using law. There's also different sets of laws from not only different countries, but also different industries. It's a mess. So let's get into some of the mess with one of the most beautiful places, at least in my opinion, of California, with Yosemite National Park. So the Timber and Stone Act especially was a threat against Yosemite because, as you can see here, there's a potential for lots of timber, and there's also a lot of stone. So when we say stone, the stone part of the Timber and Stone Act was mining. So that isn't just gold mining, it also could be coal mining. Frankly, especially as far as California was concerned, the US really had no idea about what kind of natural resources were here and why. So they were just basically blind selling at just bargain rates, beautiful places like Yosemite. So Yosemite is now a national park, and it lies in the central Sierra Nevada mountains, and it's about 150 miles east of San Francisco. If you haven't been there, I strongly encourage you to go. It is beautiful. David, we'll discuss the Pacific Railroad Act. I don't have it in this slide, but we can talk about it later if you'd like. Sorry, I got distracted with the chat. So we have Yosemite right here. So you can see it is, oh wait, where am I? No, it should be right around, oh, it's right here. It's like, wait, well, there's Modesto and Merced. I drive through that all the time. It is right there. So technically 150, but it takes forever. It from my perspective, I would not drive from San Francisco, but yes, it is right there. Why did that come out so blurry? Okay, sorry. So we have the Merced River, and we also have the Tuolumne River that flows through Yosemite National Park. Again, there's a lot of water, as you can see here. At least before the drought, we had a lot of waterfalls. So there's a lot of natural resources here, with, especially in California, a place that is so dry, a place that is so kind of prone to just, it's very hard to farm here, especially where we farm today. And we'll talk about industrial agriculture, I think, next week. But it seemed really tempting to try to make this space into, if not an urban place, then a place of industry and agriculture of some sort. Again, the first inhabitants of Yosemite were the Awanichi. There were also a little bit south were the Miwok and the Pomo. And you have gold miners who are coming into Yosemite in 1851. This scared a lot of people who were early Californian conservationists, because in 1864, Abraham Lincoln signed the Yosemite Yosemite Grant, and set aside Yosemite Valley and Mariposa Grove of redwoods. They were called redwoods at the time. They're actually giant sequoia. Anyway, getting lost in the weeds, as a state of California supervised public reserve. It wasn't clear what Lincoln meant by signing this grant. It wasn't clear what it could possibly mean, but he wanted to save it, frankly, because people like John Muir and some of his more some of his very rich San Francisco friends kept bugging him about it. So he was like, okay, I will put it aside. Okay, we've got it. So here we can see 1890, we have John Muir and one of his friends, Robert Underwood Johnson, who was an editor of the Century magazine, persuading Congress further into making the highlands of Yosemite a national park, because they wanted to protect the highlands from grazing and timber harvesting. Again, that Timber and Stone Act. John Muir basically talked to whoever he needed to in order to push his agenda. So here is John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt in 1903 at Glacier Point, Yosemite National Park, also a very fun place that you can only access in summer. You should do it. Both men were instrumental in the establishment of the national park system, to which we know Yosemite belongs. So John Muir, his dates are 1838 to 1914. So he's partly responsible, but I would say very responsible, for the development of Yellowstone, Yosemite, and Sequoia National Parks. So he, like you saw on this last slide, encouraged President Roosevelt to establish these parks. He mobilized his mission even further with the creation of the Sierra Club, and he has the John Muir Redwood Forest near San Francisco named after him. His work is also on our state quarter, which, if you were a kid when I was a kid, this was very exciting. I don't think many of you were kids when I was a kid, so just go along with me with my nostalgia. Other acts that are kind of working at this time to support Californian conservation, to go against the Homestead Act and the Timber and Stone Act, was the establishment of the Antiquities Act of 1906, which established the first federal policy for the protection of cultural resources on land owned or controlled by the federal government. And this authorized the president the power to create national monuments by proclamation to protect historic, prehistoric, and scientific objects on federally owned land. We also have the National Park Service Organic Act of 1916. This creates a National Park Service Before then, these lands were operated primarily through the military, especially the cavalry, and this act made it possible for Congress to create the National Park Service, and it prescribes its fundamental purpose to conserve the scenery and natural and historic objects and wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same, as will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. So this is a great goal. This is a beautiful, in my opinion, goal. However, it's an impossible goal. What does it mean to leave something unimpaired? Is preservation, so this call for preservation, where you just keep everything exactly in place, is that even possible? How can you promise that something will not change, especially with environments where that's their whole point? They change with the seasons, they change with different generations of animals, especially people. And then when you consider people and the culture that they bring to things, that'll impact the management of parks too, or places that would become parks, through the creation of infrastructure to make it possible for more people to visit. And when more people are visiting, that impacts the ecosystem. So all of this is to say is that a lot of these laws were made with the best intentions in mind. Like truly, even the Timber and Stone Act, which was very focused on just using the land as much as possible, they were used with the best of intentions, but they have either negative consequences or just hopes that can never be actualized. So this is getting ahead of the plot of our class a little bit, but with the creation of the National Park System, with the Organic Act, we have the National Park Service, and that created a network of 40 national parks and monuments. But I bring this up in this lecture because most of this is starting in California. While Yellowstone is technically the first national park, it's in 1872. It isn't until it isn't really that wasn't the first one, because we have Lincoln protecting Yosemite in 1864. So which one was truly the first national park is a debate that park rangers have between themselves all the time. But much of the wider, broader conservation movement, not just in the state of California, not just in the US, but I mean, really all over the world, began in California, which isn't just tooting our own horn. Like, conservation and preservation didn't exist in the ways that we understand them now, until the work of John Muir, who did a lot of really great things, but he was also not explicitly part of these nativist circles and discriminatory circles, but he hung out with a lot of people who did, like Theodore Roosevelt. So the National Park Service now has well over, I think these are some old figures, but well over 384 national parks in 49 states, the District of Columbia, Guam, American Samoa, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands. I have a ... because who knows of what American imperialism will do to add to that list. I feel like we're running out of time, so I'm not going to go over the NPS numbers, but I'm going to stop sharing. We're just about at time. Yeah, so any questions, comments, concerns? I can talk about the Pacific Railroad Act if you would like, David, but I'm going to stop recording before